In 1858, in Chicago, a thin government plain volume is printed and bound, a sewerage report produced by a city still half built on marshy ground. Its cover carries a date that does not match its own imprint. It says the plan was adopted on 31 December 1855, yet the publication date on the title page is 3 years later. A small contradiction, the kind clerks live with, the kind historians usually ignore. Inside, the pages read like civic hygiene. Measurements, gradients, brick diameters, street lines. But the plates, the drawings meant to clarify, do something stranger. They show a city not merely improving, but lifting itself. A new grade drawn above an old grade, like a second horizon placed over the first. The lines are so calm, so technical, that the implication almost disappears. Whole blocks will be raised. Sidewalks will become terraces. Doors will sit above their former thresholds. Windows will drift toward the ground as if the street itself is rising to meet them. Officially, this is not mystery. It is sanitation, drainage, an answer to epidemics and standing water. But a visual contradiction survives in the geometry. If the new street is higher, then the old street becomes by definition underground. A city plan that includes, quietly, the burial of its own earlier level. There is a particular feeling to these 19th century civic diagrams, a confidence that engineering can overwrite landscape and that paperwork can overwrite memory. On paper, the change is a clean line. In real streets, it becomes a residue: basement doors that used to be ground floors, bricked-in windows, staircases that lead down to nowhere. History remembers progress, but progress often leaves behind layers. And if a city can be raised like a stage set, streets, sewers, buildings, then the question is not whether a reset happened. The question is simpler and colder. Who moved in after the platform was rebuilt? And why did it need new people to make it feel normal again? Dust drifts in the reading room light. The plate is silent, but the linework suggests a faint mechanical hum, as if the city itself is an instrument being tuned. On 31 December 1855, in Chicago, a board of sewerage commissioners adopts a plan intended to solve a practical problem. Waste and water cannot leave the city. The streets sit too low. The ground holds stagnant pools. Summer heat turns standing water into a laboratory for disease. Official language stays polite: nuisance, filth, drainage, but the urgency is implied by the pace of decisions and the scale of proposed work. The artifact is bureaucratic and oddly intimate, a report printed for civic use, a volume meant to be handled, underlined, argued over. Its drawings are not romantic cross-sections, street profiles, gradients, yet they contain a kind of city-wide anatomy. In a sense, the report is Chicago's first attempt to draw itself as a machine. A human trace appears, where human traces often survive best, in the little marks of labor, drafting styles, ink thickness, the habit of measurement. Even when signatures fade, a city's engineering pages keep the handprints of those who believed the future could be built from brick curves and consistent slope. The official story is straightforward: build sewers, raise grades where needed, and move waste away from drinking water. It is a sanitation revolution, not a metaphysical one. And yet, even at the start, the record offers a small timestamp unease. The plan is adopted in 1855, but it reaches the public as a bound object in 1858. 3 years is not a mystery. It can be explained by printing, politics, revisions. The archive is consistent enough to satisfy a historian. But for a viewer looking for the feeling of a reset, the delay reads differently, as if the city decided to transform itself, and only later produced the paperwork that made it appear inevitable. Outside the committee rooms, winter air presses against wooden walls. Inside, the language of progress begins. The first motif arrives almost silently, a low hum, the imagined sound of flow in a pipe that does not yet exist. And the unanswered question settles in early. If the city is planning to rebuild its underworld, what must be rebuilt above it to match? In July and August 1858, in central London, the heat makes the Thames unbearable. The event, later nicknamed the Great Stink, is often described as a smell crisis, but the smell is only the public-facing symptom. Officially, the solution that follows is engineering, intercepting sewers, embankments, pumping stations, an infrastructure built large enough to outlast the century that designed it. The artifact anchor here is not a single photograph, but a convergence of evidence types, newspaper descriptions of the stink, political urgency and parliamentary debate, and the technical drawings that translate disgust into brick-lined tunnels. The most revealing documents are often the least dramatic, sectional views showing gradients, pipe diameters, and where gravity stops being enough. A human witness line survives because it is practical and almost bleakly humorous. During planning, the chief engineer is later remembered as saying that they would only do this once, and there was always the unforeseen. He doubled the diameter of key pipes. It reads like an engineer's proverb. It also reads like someone quietly admitting that cities expand beyond the imagination of their planners. No contradiction is required to keep this credible. The historical record of London's sanitary rebuild is abundant and consistent, yet the visual language can still produce a certain interpretive friction. Why do pumping stations resemble ornate civic monuments? Why do brick tunnels have proportions that feel ceremonial, arched, rhythmic, almost ecclesiastical? The official explanation is simple. Victorians often designed utilities with architectural dignity, and public works were a form of state pride. That is enough. But a speculative reading, careful, unprovable, adds a second layer. When you build a city's hidden systems at monumental scale, you are not only moving waste, you are redefining what a city is and what kinds of people it can hold. Here the recurring motif shifts from hum to echo, the imagined reverberation inside long masonry corridors, water moving like a slow breath. And the timestamp unease arrives as a broader pattern rather than a single discrepancy. London reforms sanitation in the same era other capitals redraw themselves. Separate histories, same decade. The archive does not call it coordination, but the rhythm is there. In 1857, in Vienna, an imperial decree sets a transformation into motion with unusually personal language, the demolition of old walls, and the creation of a ring boulevard. The city expands, traffic and prestige demand space. The record treats it as modernization, an urban redesign that turns medieval constraints into 19th century visibility. The artifact anchor is the decree itself and the plans that follow. Where fortifications once controlled entry, a broad ring now displays institutions, opera, museums, government buildings, architecture arranged like a statement about what matters. A human trace appears in the voice of authority. It is not sentimental. It is administrative power, expressed in a phrase that survives precisely because it is so direct. Es ist mein Wille. It is my will. In the official story, this is political theatre and urban planning united, an empire staging itself in stone. The contradiction here is not that the record is missing, it is that the record is too confident. The plans assume a future in which demolition is clean and history is malleable. Walls come down, moats fill, a new street exists. The archive is consistent. Dates, phases, openings. So if the records are consistent, where does the unease come from? It comes from the visual effect of replacement. Cities do not merely expand, they overwrite. The ring road becomes a new boundary, a new logic. People who once lived by the wall now live by a boulevard. Trades shift, rents shift. The city's memory shifts, and it does so without needing conspiracy, only capital, policy. The recurring motif becomes static, not literal radio static yet, but the conceptual noise that appears when an old pattern is removed and a new pattern is forced into place. The sound of rubble, the silence after a wall is gone, and the question that lingers at the end of the first act is simple. If multiple cities in the same era are rebuilt to new templates, sanitation, boulevards, monumental utilities, what social function does that rebuilding serve beyond health and traffic? If history is written by survivors, who decided which streets would survive at all? In January 1858, in Chicago, a masonry building is raised on jack screws. The record preserves the event because it was both engineering and spectacle. Hundreds of men, thousands of screws, and a heavy structure lifted inches at a time until a new foundation could be built beneath it. Later accounts describe crowds watching as if it were theatre. The artifact anchor is the press description, street-level journalism witnessing something almost absurdly calm. A building lifted without the slightest injury, as the story goes, because the lift is controlled, incremental, and repetitive. It is labor turned into choreography. A human witness line does not need a named diarist here. The crowd itself is the witness. People allowed to walk at the old ground level among the jacks on the final day, looking up at the underside of a city they normally stand on. The sensation standing where a floor used to be would be difficult to forget. Yet most cities do forget, because the new street level becomes normal faster than anyone expects. Here the contradiction is physical, not archival. If a building can be raised, then the former ground becomes a kind of basement, and if the street is later raised again, the basement becomes a deeper layer. In this way, a city can create an underground without excavation only by adding height. Is this mysterious? Officially, no. It is a response to drainage. But to the camera, a raised city resembles a city that has been buried. The timestamp unease is subtle and documentary friendly. Later retellings vary on details: how high, how many buildings, which corner first. The official engineering fact remains. Chicago was raised in the mid-19th century. The exactness blurs at the edges in popular memory, which is how public works become folklore. The recurring motif becomes a measurable vibration, the metallic creak of screws under load, the slow settling of brick. And the question sharpens. If you can change the ground floor of a city, how many old floors are hidden in plain sight beneath sidewalks, behind bricked windows, inside the silence of basements? In 1853, Paris receives a prefect tasked with remaking the city. By 1860, annexation expands its area and population in one administrative motion. Officially, the logic is sanitation, circulation, and imperial aesthetics. Bring air and light, unify neighborhoods, build boulevards that modernize movement. The artifact anchors are the before and after maps and the demolition arithmetic. Old streets removed, new streets cut through. The archive is extensive, and it is not fragile. Paris is famous partly because it documented itself while it was changing. A human witness line appears in conflict rather than agreement. Critics wept for the old Paris, even as others welcomed the modern one. The record does not require us to choose sides. It preserves the argument. A documented interpretive tension also appears. Later critics argue the boulevards were strategic, designed to prevent barricades and enable troop movement. Defenders respond that hygiene and beauty drove the plan. Even the planner himself acknowledges, in different tones, that wider streets have military value while insisting it was not his primary intention. The archive contains both the claim and the denial, and the viewer is left with something more honest than certainty. A city can be redesigned for multiple reasons at once. Here, the contradiction is not missing paperwork, it is the coexistence of motives. Public health is real, political control is real. A boulevard can be an artery for commerce and a corridor for soldiers, without needing secret committees. The timestamp unease can be filmed as an editing cut. One publication calls a street new in 1865, while a different official description measures its completion in 1867. These are not scandals, just the messy difference between opening, finishing, and declaring finished. But the effect is cinematic. The city is always slightly ahead of its own dates. The recurring motif becomes a hollow wind moving down long straight streets, air as sanitation, air as surveillance, air as the sound of a city made legible. And the question becomes harder to avoid. When you rebuild a city at this scale, who is the city for afterward? Who is invited to stay? And who is pushed outward until a new population fills the space? By the late 1860s, in American cities, a particular kind of artifact spreads. Fire insurance maps that record building footprints, construction materials, hydrants, and risk with obsessive detail. These maps are not created for romance or memory, they are created to price catastrophe. The artifact anchor is the map sheet itself, blocks broken into rectangles, building outlines colored by material, annotations that note factories, hotels, stables, churches. To a documentary camera, A fire insurance map looks like an X-ray of urban intent, not what a city claims to be, but what insurers believe it contains. The human witness line here is quieter, not a diarist, but an underwriter's implied voice. Wood here, brick there, hazard here. It is the language of risk translated into geometry. The record is generally consistent. Fire insurance mapping is well attested. It grows because cities burn, expand, and demand quantification. But this is where interpretation begins to generate the sensation of anomaly without inventing missing documents. Because maps do a strange thing. They make change look clean. A neighborhood can be labeled rebuilt, while the footprints show older patterns persisting. A street can be widened, yet a block still carries pre-existing geometry. The official story says modernization replaces the old. The artifact suggests a hybrid, new surfaces laid over old logic. The timestamp unease can be presented carefully. A map series is updated in editions, and later reproductions can confuse which year belongs to which revision. Nothing conspiratorial is required, only the reality that paper outlives memory and is recopied with imperfect labeling. The recurring motif becomes paper static. The sound of turning sheets, the faint crackle of dried ink, the hum of a city reduced to notation. In the archive, the neighborhoods are labeled improved. On the map, the old footprints still cast shadows. If history is written by survivors, who renamed the streets that did not survive the rewrite? In 1859, in London, construction begins on new outfall sewers and intercepting systems that will run for years. The official story is engineering heroism under pressure. Sewage must be carried away from the city. Pumping stations must lift waste from low ground to higher pipes. Embankments must contain both sewage and river. The artifact anchors are the sectional drawings and the pumping station structures that, even today, resemble temples built for a mechanical religion. Ornate ironwork, tall windows, symmetrical facades. A Victorian habit. Hide the filth, but do not hide the pride. A documented human witness line survives because newspapers were stunned by the scale. The work is described as extraordinary and expensive, and in the public imagination, it becomes a proof that modernity can be manufactured underfoot. No archival contradiction is needed. The record is consistent. Miles of sewers, years of construction, public debate, the shift from river as drain to river as symbol again. So the forgotten technology here is not secret. It is simply that the city becomes a machine whose most essential parts are designed to be unseen. The 19th century perfects a new kind of invisibility. Sanitation without visibility. Flow without witness. This is where the speculative reading can be introduced carefully, as interpretation rather than claim. Some modern viewers, encountering these monumental hidden systems, feel they are looking at remnants of an earlier template, cathedrals built for function, not faith. But the historical record must remain honest. Victorian civic pride and industrial ornament explain the architecture adequately. Still, the feeling persists because of scale. Brick tunnels are not only pipes, they are corridors, rhythmic and resonant. If you film inside them, sound behaves differently. Footsteps echo, voices flatten, water becomes a low, continuous note. The recurring motif becomes literal resonance, a sustained hum inside masonry, like a city breathing through engineered lungs. And the question becomes technological. Did 19th century planners merely solve sanitation, or did they also discover that controlling flow, water, waste, people, is the deepest form of city control? In 1863, in Chicago, work begins on a lake tunnel designed to draw cleaner water from farther out, away from shoreline contamination. Officially, it is a rational response to an unavoidable problem. A growing city draws drinking water from the same system into which it sends waste. The solution is distance, depth, and engineering persistence. The artifact anchors are engineering descriptions of the tunnel's path, and the intake structures, cribs placed offshore, meant to sip cleaner water. The concept is simple. The execution is audacious. The human trace here can be framed as the engineer's career itself, an individual attached to the city's hidden systems. Names are preserved not because the culture loves engineers, but because civic projects require accountability. In the record, the engineer's identity becomes a kind of signature on the city's underworld. No contradiction is necessary. The story of waterworks expansion in 19th century cities is consistent, and it occurs in multiple places with variations. What creates the sensation of anomaly is the mismatch between how life feels above ground and what exists below it. People walk on plank sidewalks and muddy streets, past storefronts and lamps, while beneath them a tunnel is cut under a lake, 60 feet down, to protect the purity of water. The 19th century is often imagined as horse-drawn and slow. The underworld tells a different story. It is industrial, precise, and quietly futuristic. The timestamp unease can be delivered as a documentary cut. Water infrastructure is built in phases. Later summaries sometimes compress multi-year projects into a single start date or completion year. The archive is not deceptive, just simplified. The recurring motif becomes water as signal, not only a resource, but a carrier of disease, and therefore a carrier of policy. Control water, and you can reshape where people live, how dense they can be, and how long they survive. And the question turns toward repopulation. Once you build systems capable of supporting far more bodies, cleaner water intakes, sewers, grades, do you then require more people to justify the investment and feed the industrial machine above? By the late 1880s and early 1890s, in European and American exposition cities, the public sees a curated version of modernity. Temporary palaces, electrified boulevards, domes and towers, ornamental ironwork architecture presented as a future that has already arrived. Officially, these exhibitions are national pride and industrial display. The artifact anchors are photographs and engravings, luminous night scenes, crowds moving like currents, facades that look permanent even when records describe them as temporary. The camera loves these places because they are designed to be photographed, even before photography becomes cheap. A human witness line can be responsibly framed as the press tone rather than a specific quote. Contemporary coverage repeatedly describes awe, scale, and the sensation of entering a new age. Workers and visitors react differently. One sees scaffolding, the other sees miracles. Here, the archival tension must be handled with restraint. Many exposition structures are documented as temporary, and many were dismantled. The records are often consistent. Yet the visual contradiction remains. A temporary palace can look as heavy as a cathedral. This is where the speculative interpretation can be introduced carefully. Some later writers hypothesized that fairs and expositions sometimes repurposed existing structures or relied on pre-existing urban infrastructure that appears too mature for a temporary event. The narrative must not claim this as fact. It is a lens, not a conclusion. The timestamp unease can be presented honestly. Photographs are frequently reprinted and captioned in different years, and later compilations can misdate images. This is not evidence of suppression, it is evidence of reproduction. But it produces a cinematic effect. The same dome appears in 1889 in one book and in 1893 in another, because editors chase theme rather than precision. The recurring motif becomes electric flicker, early illumination that pulses, the faint buzz of wiring, the sense that light itself has become industrial, and the repopulation question becomes cultural. When a city stages modernity as spectacle, it attracts bodies, workers, immigrants, tourists, investors. The city becomes a magnet. Was that the real reason? Not secret, just structural. Infrastructure plus spectacle equals migration. In the 1880s and 1890s, in cities like Chicago, public health thinking shifts as bacteriological discoveries spread. Before that, policies often focus on dirt and miasma filth as a general cause. Afterward, the city begins to treat water and waste not only as nuisances, but as vectors. The record is consistent: boards of health, inspection regimes, sanitation departments, and a slow professionalization of urban survival. The artifact anchor can be filmed as an ordinary-looking letter or municipal memo. Citizens complaining of smells, outbreaks, contaminated water, crowded housing. Paper that contains fear without drama. In the archive, it is filed. In life, it is the difference between a child living and dying. A human witness line is best handled here as paraphrase rather than invented dialogue. Residents and officials increasingly link sickness to water supply and sewage disposal. Anxiety becomes administrative language. Contradiction is not necessary. The historical shift is well documented. The unease instead comes from a realization. The 19th century city expands not only because of industry, but because mortality begins to change. With better water, sewage, and knowledge, more people survive urban density. The timestamp unease can be framed as two clocks running at once. Engineering advances on one schedule, medical understanding catches up on another. A sewer can be built before germs are accepted as real. A city can be raised before anyone knows precisely why disease spreads. The archive contains both timelines, and they do not perfectly align. The recurring motif becomes silence after fever, the quiet that follows an epidemic wave, the way a street looks unchanged, even when a quarter of its households has been altered by loss. They called it sanitation. They called it modernization. But what they truly built was capacity, an urban body designed to hold more lives than it ever had before. If history is written by survivors, who decided that capacity should be filled and by whom? In 1871, in Chicago, fire destroys an enormous portion of the city. Officially, it is catastrophe followed by reconstruction. What matters for this story is not only what burned, but what happened next. Despite fire and even national economic depression later in the decade, the city's population growth continues, and the rebuilt city becomes a magnet again. The artifact anchor is statistical and blunt, census counts that show the city swelling rather than shrinking in the long run. Numbers are not poetic, but they are the cleanest evidence of repopulation. A human trace appears here in the most common way human traces appear in urban records. Names on arrival lists, addresses in directories, occupations in enumerations. Not one hero, many ordinary lives compressed into categories. If you need a contradiction, the archive offers a gentle one without scandal. Population figures differ depending on whether you compare city limits before annexations or after, or whether you compare estimates to official counts. This is administrative complexity, not conspiracy. But to the camera, it looks like the city's size changes depending on which boundary a clerk draws. The official explanation for repopulation is consistent: industry, railroads, jobs, and the momentum of a growing metropolis. But the documentary can hold a second layer without breaking non-fiction. Repopulation is also necessary to make reconstruction feel successful. A rebuilt street without people is only masonry. A sewer without density is overbuilt. A boulevard without crowds is an empty corridor. This is the real reason in a sober sense. Infrastructure creates capacity. Capital and policy seek to fill it. Migration does the rest. If there is suppression, it is usually mundane. The forgetting of the displaced, the poor pushed outward, the neighborhoods erased and renamed. The recurring motif becomes footsteps, the sound of new shoes on new sidewalks laid over older grades. And the question becomes moral rather than technical. Who benefits when a city repopulates those who arrive, or those who owned the rebuilt platform before anyone else? By the late 19th century, into the early 20th, in multiple cities, the phenomenon repeats in different forms: regrading, raising, filling, straightening, burying. Officially, these are engineering solutions: flood control, drainage, traffic, sanitation. Over time, the earlier street level becomes a curiosity. People point to a window half buried in sidewalk grade and treat it as a quirky relic, not a clue. The artifact anchors are visual and contemporary: staircases descending to sealed doors, bricked arches under newer sidewalks, photographs showing construction zones where the city appears to be building a second city over the first. These images are real enough to feel like evidence of something deeper, even when official explanations remain sufficient. A human witness line here can be responsibly framed as rumor rather than quotation. Locals tell stories of old streets beneath the current ones. Guides repeat tales. Residents inherit explanations without reading the original reports. This is where the narrative can gently lean toward the speculative framework without claiming it. For those who suspect lost systems, the buried level feels like proof of a reset, an earlier layer covered, a former order overwritten, a city tuned to a new frequency. But the record, when consulted, often remains consistent. Engineering created these layers intentionally. Streets were raised, sewers demanded slope, floods demanded fill. The mystery is not in the fact of layering, it is in the cultural willingness to forget the scale of what was done. The timestamp unease can be presented as an editing trick grounded in truth. A photograph from an infrastructure project is reprinted decades later, with a vague caption, "The year softened into late 19th century, the specificity dissolved." That is how public memory becomes fog. The recurring motif becomes radio-like silence. The absence of voices from the workers once the job is complete. The way the city goes quiet about its own transformation as soon as it becomes normal. And the question becomes archival. If the record explains the engineering, what part of the story is still missing? Perhaps not a secret civilization, but the human cost of displacement and the deliberate forgetting that follows any modernization. Return to the first artifact. The sewerage report, with its mismatched dates adopted in 1855, printed in 1858, and the plates that show a new grade drawn above an old. The city is an instrument diagrammed in ink. From this angle, the Great Reset becomes a modern label placed over a historical process that is thoroughly documented. 19th century cities rebuilt themselves through sanitation, boulevards, regrading, waterworks, and exhibition modernity. They increased capacity, reduced certain forms of mortality, and rewired how bodies could be concentrated. The repopulation that followed is also documented. Migration toward jobs, toward infrastructure, toward the magnet of modern spectacle. There is nothing supernatural required, and yet the feeling of suppression can still be filmed without lying. Not suppression as a single secret order, but as a pattern of forgetting. The paper exists, but few read it. The engineering is visible, but treated as trivia. The displaced are counted, but not narrated. If there is an erasure, it is often bureaucratic and slow. A street renaming, a boundary change, a demolished block, an archive that preserves what officials needed to preserve and loses what the poor could not afford to preserve. Here is the careful speculative bridge explicitly marked as interpretation. Some modern researchers interpret the global rhythm of redesigned sewers, boulevards, monumental utilities, repeated domes and towers as evidence of an older template being overwritten and then repopulated to stabilize the new surface reality. The documentary cannot prove this, but it can show why the interpretation persists. The scale is too large to feel accidental, and the layers are too physical to be metaphor. The recurring motif resolves into a final acoustic image. The city at night, quiet above ground, while water moves below in brick corridors, steady, unseen, indifferent. The hum does not announce itself. It simply continues, and the last question is left suspended, like an unmeasured vibration. If the platform was rebuilt to hold more lives, who decided what kind of lives should fill it? The film reel ends mid-frame. The paper plate remains open. The line work keeps humming.